It's Dave from ThinkOutsideTheSlide.com. Recently, I presented a session at the Excel Virtually Global Conference on my 5 favorite Excel chart hacks. In this video, I want to share with you hack number 2, using invisible segments to position visible segments. I'll link to the playlist with all 5 hacks in the top right corner. I want to start by sharing with you the hack as I presented it during the conference session. Then I'll come back and share some additional tips, ideas, or resources to help you apply this idea to your Excel charts. Let's start with the video from the conference session. Our next chart hack, which is to use invisible segments to position visible segments in a chart. And this is what I use to create waterfall charts. This is my preferred method for creating waterfall charts. This is an example here, and this is created using a stacked column chart, not the built-in waterfall chart in Excel. I find that that isn't flexible enough and doesn't give me the flexibility I want as a chart creator. So I create them using a stacked column chart. Now these green and gold segments that appear to float up above the axis, those are actually being supported by invisible segments that are there to support and position them, but they're turned to be invisible so that it's invisible, making visible positioned where we want them to be. And so I want to show you how this is done in Excel using a simpler example, using a steps to a total graph. It's kind of like a waterfall graph that starts at 0. So let's go over to Excel and let me show you how we can use these invisible segments to position visible segments. So we're back in Excel, and this is our data. We have our 4 regions and the sales from each of these regions. And what we want to do is we want to show how these sales add up to the total overall sales. And when you bring data in, one of the things I always find helpful for me is to have that data in one part of my worksheet, usually close to the top, and that could be either you copy it in from another worksheet or it's linked to another worksheet, but it brings the data in from your analysis. And then I set up a separate chart data table. Why? Because this allows me to have those extra data series. And you'll see right here my Spacer 1 series. When I'm using invisible segments, data series, I always set them to be spacer because it gives me that clue that, hey, this is just a space. It's not going to be shown. And so what I'm doing is I'm setting up a stacked column chart. Spacer 1 is going to be my first segment. That's going to start down at the bottom if there's a value there. And then the next segment is going to be my sales. So this allows me to position an invisible segment at the bottom that supports a visible segment on top of it. And I actually have 3 data series here. So I have my spacer series, invisible, sales, which is visible, and then I have a total series. Why do I have the total series separate from the sales? Because I want the flexibility to be able to change that formatting, especially the color I want to be able to change. And this allows me to just change the data series instead of changing one point or one column in the column chart. Now, how am I going to create this? Well, first of all, let's take a look at the calculation. So Spacer 1 is set to 0 for the first column here because, well, there's nothing before it. If you're using a waterfall chart, again, it's probably going to be 0 because you have a starting value. Then we have our next calculation. And here's where the calculation here is really quite simple. It's just the previous spacer, B15, plus the sales value. So what was the previous spacer, and then add on the visible segment because that creates the invisible portion for the next support. Now in a waterfall chart, this is going to be a little more complicated because you have to decide whether that previous segment is up or down and this segment is it up or down. So the formula is a little more complicated, but the idea is the same. We're figuring out how much space does the visible segment need below it in order for it to be positioned properly in the chart. I'm using a simpler example just so we can sort of get the idea here. Now, for our total, we don't have anything in the Spacer 1 or the sales because, again, we want that to stand out. And I've just calculated the total here. Simple, just add the spacer, the last spacer plus the last sales, and that's our total. So now we're going to create this chart. I'm going to select all of the rows and the columns and I'm going to insert, and I'm going to select my stacked column. And I'm just going to zoom in for a second here. You want to make sure you're selecting this one, the stacked column, not this other one, 100% stacked. That's not going to give you what you want. You want to make sure you select the stacked column. That's the one that we want. And we see in our chart here, we have our orange segments that are the visible segments and the blue, which are invisible. How do we turn them to be invisible? Well, it's really quite simple. We can select that particular segment, and then we can go to the chart format ribbon. And in the chart format ribbon, in shape fill, I can say no fill. And you'll notice that immediately it makes them invisible. Now, when I select the visible segment, the sales segment, I can change it to whatever color I want. So for example, if I want that fill color to be, let's see, this green, and then the total, I want that to be the blue, I can do that. And now I can get rid of the legend because it's not really telling me anything. The labels down on the horizontal axis tell me everything I need. And now I've created a steps to a total chart. So just like a waterfall chart, it allows us to see each of the segments and compare those segments to each other. Clearly, region C is the largest sales segment for this particular time period. And it constitutes, looks to be close to half of the total. And that's how these particular charts are really valuable. And a great way to create them is to use this chart hack, to use invisible segments to position those visible segments. Of course, you can format this any way you want. You can make the columns wider, as I showed you in the previous example. But this is how we use this chart hack. During the session at the conference, John Peltier, who is the world's foremost expert on Excel charts, pointed out that when we're looking at what I call the spacer segment, that segment that's going to be invisible, just zoom in on the name here for you. For that segment that I call spacer 1, he said that he names his blank. And it's an additional way to sort of give him a heads up, hey, you got to turn this segment blank. And you notice I also number mine. So the reason I number it is because in PowerPoint, when you have multiple data series with the same name, it gets confused. So that's why I number them if I need to use multiple ones. Now let me show you some more examples of this idea of using invisible segments to make visible segments positioned where you want them to be. So I've got a number of examples of these type of visuals on my website, and I'm going to show you some of those pages. I will link to all of these pages in the description below this video. So the first is the example where you can use this idea instead of in a column chart, in a bar chart. So here we see different segments adding up to the total expenses for, let's say, expense reporting. Again, it allows you to see the segments compared to each other and compared to the total. We can also take this idea and create essentially a waterfall chart that is using bars instead of using columns. And this is a more complex example I'm showing you where it has some interim totals in terms of total revenue, net revenue, those sorts of things. But it shows you how advanced we can make these waterfall style charts, whether it's bars or columns, and the bars again are an advantage when these labels here on the left are longer. So each of these pages has not only an example, but also a video that explains that example. And here we have some invisible segments being used to create a multiple diverging bar chart using just one bar chart. So here's where we are kind of extending the idea and saying, hey, we can use individual segments to make it look like there are multiple charts. So there are those spacer segments in between these bars and calculated so that they line up as if the bar charts are separate bar charts, but it's all actually one bar chart. And then this one where we're actually showing what's called a small multiples bar chart. So this, again, looks like multiple bar charts, but in fact, it's just one bar chart. And so in between each of the visible segments and the next visible segment is an invisible segment. And so you start to see how you can leverage this idea of invisible segments to really build those advanced charts that are the visuals which explain your message to the viewers, those executives or decision makers that you're presenting to. That's one of the hacks that I shared during my Excel Virtually Global conference session. To see all the hacks that I shared and all the additional information, use the link beside me to open the playlist that has the videos for all 5 hacks. Thanks for watching.